Welcome to today's deep dive with SK to the point. Today we're going to look at one of Sri Lanka's most storied political movements, especially in the last 5 years, and also the history of the NPP, which started out as the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna or the JVP, and the rise of its political leader, Anura Kumara Dissanayake. From its revolutionary origins to its present day prominence, the JVP has carved out a unique place in Sri Lanka's political history. If you were to take a step back and look at how this entire Marxist leader, that is Anura, and his NPP, which has now come to the fore in Sri Lanka's political spectrum, and Anura is the next president of the island nation. If you were to look back at his origins, we have to start off from the JVP, which was founded in 1965 by Rohana Vijayveera. He was a man of humble beginnings who, despite financial hardships, became a very powerful figure of the Sri Lankan leftist movement. After studying Marxist ideologies abroad in Moscow, Vijayveera returned to Sri Lanka and formed the JVP, aiming to lead the country towards a socialist revolution, solutioned by the socio-economic inequalities that marked post-colonial Sri Lanka. In 1971, the JVP launched its first insurrection against the government, which was then led by Sirima Bandaranayake. Although it was a very short-lived rebellion, the impact was seismic. The insurrection left thousands dead and saw an eventual crackdown with the help of the Indian armed forces. And despite this defeat, the JVP maintained its position as a key force of Sinhala nationalism, adapting over the decades of the changing political landscape. One of the darkest chapters of the JVP has to be the period between 87 and 89, during what is known as its second insurrection. In response to the Indian involvement in Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict, the JVP incited mass protests and violent uprisings across the south. These were met with brutal government retaliation, leading to the deaths of an estimated 60,000 people, including JVP's founder Vijayveera. This was also when JVP slowly started moving away from the Marxist ideology and somewhat started becoming a Sinhala socialist party per se, that ensured that it also lost a bit of its USP, and this duration was also coupled with the emergence of other leftist organizations in the country. Following this devastating period, the JVP kind of reinvented itself. By the 1990s, early 1990s, you had a new leadership. The party made a move from armed insurgency to mainstream politics. It entered parliamentary elections in 1994, gradually rebuilding its credibility, to say. This was when Anura Kumara Dissanayake started making his mark, if you'd like to say. Born in a rural village of Tambutagama, Anura Kumara Dissanayake's own story mirrors that of many in the JVP. He also came from a very humble background, the son of a daily wage worker and a homemaker, and earned a degree in science from the University of Kelaniya. Like many of his generation, his political journey began in student movements, and during the late 1980s, he joined the JVP during its anti-government uprisings. By 1995, 1 year after JVP came back to electoral politics and started contesting elections, Dissanayake had also risen to a position of influence within the party, becoming the national organizer of the Socialist Student Association. In the years that followed, his leadership skills became more evident, and in 2000 he was elected to parliament. 14 years later, he became the leader of the JVP. Under Dissanayake, the JVP sought to distance itself from its violent past, naturally, and with him being the first party leader to publicly apologize for the crimes committed during the insurrections. His leadership has been marked by a focus on anti corruption, clear governance, and policies aimed at addressing economic disparities in Sri Lanka. His influence grew further when, in 2015, Dissanayake formed the National People's Power, the NPP Alliance, which has now become the leading political alliance in Sri Lanka, bringing together various civil society groups, political organizations, and trade unions under a single banner. This was seen as a strategic move to rebrand the JVP with a strong focus on tackling corruption and renegotiating the country's economic policies. Dissanayaka's leadership came to the forefront during Sri Lanka's 2022 economic crisis. As public frustration with the Gotabaya Rajapakse government grew, the NPP positioned itself as the voice of the people, earning widespread support. Dissanayaka's criticism, especially of the IMF deal that Sri Lanka sought after, and his opposition to foreign control of national assets, resonated deeply with the working class and students alike. Earlier this year, in a significant diplomatic move, Anura Kumara Dissanayake was invited to New Delhi for high level meetings with India's National Security Advisor and External Affairs Minister. This was the first time the JVP leadership had been formally received by Indian officials, which is a clear signal that India was acknowledging Anura's rising prominence in Sri Lanka's politics. The meetings were viewed as India's recognition of the changing political dynamics in Sri Lanka as they prepare for potential shifts in the leadership. These interactions are also seen as a strategic move, with India seeking to strengthen ties with potential future leader who has traditionally been wary of India's influence but is now adopting a more pragmatic stance towards its largest neighbor. Though the JVP and NPP have historically been critical of the Indian influence, especially during the tumultuous years of the 1980s, there has been a recent shift recognizing the geopolitical realities. Dissanayake and JVP have adapted a more pragmatic approach, acknowledging the importance of India as a partner in this global economy. Anura Kumara Dissanayake, very importantly, only got around 3.5% of votes in 2019. But this time round, he was already being viewed as a serious contender for the presidency, and the results now show how his campaign has panned out. His call for an end to corruption, bringing out economic reforms, and a return to parliamentary democracy has struck a chord with many who are disillusioned by the failures of the ruling elite. An important thing to note, as I had spoken about in my earlier video, the voting patterns of Tamils has made a major impact in catapulting Anura into becoming the president. The northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka, which has the majority of Tamils in the island nation, largely voted for Sajith Premadesa and their own candidate P. Aryanethran. But this vote split has also helped Anura to edge out Sajith in the overall leads. Anura's focus on corruption, economic justice, and rejecting international financial dominance has resonated with key segments of the population, including students, workers, and other groups. However, his challenge remains in breaking the grip of the long-standing political families like the Rajapaksas and overcoming the JVP's historical baggage, which will be used as a strong criticizing factor if and when there are hiccups in his presidency. Nevertheless, his growing popularity and the support he has garnered as an anti establishment leader could very well make him a defining figure in Sri Lanka's next political chapter. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the JVP and the rise of Anura Kumara Dissanayake. Stay tuned for more in depth explorations of political movements that shape our world. Until then, see you around.